Welcome to Literacy Talks, the podcast for literacy leaders and champions everywhere. Brought to you by Reading Horizons, Literacy Talks is the place to discover new ideas, trends, insights, and practical strategies that will help all learners reach reading proficiency. Our series host is Stacy Hurst, a professor at Southern Utah University and Chief Academic Advisor for Reading Horizons. Joining Stacy are Donnell Pons, a recognized expert in literacy and special education, and Lindsay Kemeny, an elementary classroom teacher, author, and speaker. The focus of this episode is cognitive flexibility in the classroom, particularly as it relates to students' ability to switch between two different cognitive tasks. As students' literacy skills deepen, they need cognitive flexibility to master multiple meanings, varying pronunciations, writing conventions, and more. It's another important dimension of executive function. So, if you're ready to learn more about an essential skill for readers at all levels and ages, fire up your cognitive flexibility for this episode of Literacy Talks. Let's get started.
Welcome to this episode of Literacy Talks. My name is Stacy Hurst, and I'm joined today by Donnell Pons and Lindsay Kemeny. And every episode, we spend some time talking about things that are related to literacy, development, instruction, all those things. We take turns choosing topics. And today, Donnell had the job of choosing what we're going to talk about. And I think this will be a great conversation. So Donnell, talk to us. What are we talking about today?
You bet. I'm kind of giggling because the topic, if you hear it, you might go, roll your eyes and go, oh, or you might say, ooh, yay. I don't know. We'll see. We're actually going with an article. There's a lot of information on this topic. It's cognitive flexibility. That's the topic. And we're using as a basis for our conversation an article that was in the Perspectives periodical that's put out by the International Dyslexia Association. And we'll put a link to that too, so folks can look it up if you haven't, or if you're not familiar with it. The title is Change of Mind, Cognitive Flexibility in the Classroom. And it caught my eye. It's interesting because from time to time we have these conversations. We've had them amongst ourselves, and I know widely, and I find them very interesting about all of the various aspects that can impact reading for a student. And this to me is a really big one that I don't see getting that much traction. It's like an incidental. I'll put it that way. Oftentimes, if you hear anything about it, it's picked up as an incidental. But to me, and particularly with my working with older adults who this has been a challenge their whole lives, this is a big deal. This is a big piece, this cognitive flexibility. What's interesting is that I was also looking at some other material, and one of the definitions that they came up with cognitive flexibility is it's broadly defined as the mental ability to switch between thinking about two different concepts according to the context of a situation, which I thought was kind of an interesting, more specific definition. And it's a little bit different than the definition that we've got in what we're working with. And they actually, in that piece that I read, they pulled out cognitive flexibility from behavioral flexibility. But within the one article that we've been reading, they were pretty much together. The cognitive was with the behavioral flexibility. And it's just what you're thinking about. It's the ability to switch between different cognitive tasks when needed and the behavior that goes with that when you're asked to do that. And you can picture in your mind any time you might have had to interrupt someone, and it's really how they respond to that interruption. And you can guess that how high a value the thing is they're engaged in also impacts the ability to switch to that. That makes sense. You know, if you're really engaged with that thing, it's a little harder to switch, or how much you were invested in what was going to happen if the plans change, that kind of thing. And some of the recent research I've seen on it has really come out because of COVID-19. There's been a renewed interest in looking at cognitive flexibility because so many people had to switch up big time how they did things. And they kind of looked at, were people okay with that? And if they weren't, how were they able to be okay with it? It's kind of interesting. But I want to open the conversation by saying, asking Stacy and Lindsay, both of you, have you at any time had conversations with other folks in education or in teaching reading specifically where this concept of cognitive flexibility has even come up in terms of reading and teaching reading?
Not really. Except that I think we talked a little bit about this in a podcast episode several years ago or a couple years ago, because I listened to a session at IDA and they were talking about this. They had like a word. It was like grapho something semantic cognitive flexibility. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
And it was really interesting because they actually had a study where they had, done, I wish I had listened to this episode to remember or go back to my notes, but they had done something where the students were, switching off between tasks, and then it did show improvement in, I feel like it was their comprehension. But I don't know if I'm remembering that right. Do you remember that, Donnell?
Yeah, I do remember. And I remember us having a conversation about it because this has come up for me. I think I've shared many times because I have folks in my household with the ADHD profile. And so this piece is really big for us at home. We talk about it, interact with this kind of discussion about cognitive flexibility a lot. So I was interested in seeing it at IDA. So I chased that down a little further, Lindsay, to see if there were things that you could actually activities that you could have students do to improve certain aspects. And that research isn't really fantastic in saying, do this thing, you'll see an improvement.
Okay.
Yeah, so far.
Yeah, I wonder, because we don't hear about it much, right? So I kind of wonder. I heard about it the one time in that session, and then a little bit reminds me of set for variability, right? Because you'd have to be flexible and have cognitive flexibility for set for variability.
Yeah, I've had conversations with my pre-service teachers frequently, actually, about the need to be flexible as a teacher. And we have a lot of practical experiences that students plan for. They spend a significant amount of time and then they show up and something has changed. They have a fire drill and I just say that is part of teaching, and we just need to learn to be flexible. Student-wise, when I was teaching first grade, I had a student who had autism, and one of her characteristics was that she was so tied to a schedule. Like everything had to be really regimented. We met the year before she was in my class, and I remember having concerns about that because I consider myself a really flexible person. And so I also, as an educator, like to go with the teaching moment. So sometimes I didn't start my literacy block right at 10 o'clock, or I'd always say probably within 5 or 10 minutes, but she seemed really rigid. So I expressed my concerns, and the team decided to put her in my class anyway. But I did learn a lot of the things we read about in this article. I have the opportunity to put into my practice for all students, not just her. But I remember a big one was those cues. Okay, now in 10 minutes, we're going to be doing something else, and just helping her be prepared for that. So that was some real-time experience I had with this. And that was the cognitive and behavioral together, right? But this is a fascinating topic. And I, of course, too, thought about this set for variability as well.
I think it's interesting to help folks keep this all in mind. This is all under executive functioning. So I even had another article that said, think of it as an umbrella. Executive functioning is the umbrella. And within this, we have this cognitive flexibility, behavioral flexibility, of course, many other things. But they're finding this is a really important aspect. The other thing I found interesting, the article touched on, was the development of cognitive flexibility over time. And you're most primed for development of this when you're rather young, which I found was interesting. They've done some research. I even looked at another article because I found that so interesting to look at how young and then the aging, and that you're still relatively young when you're at your prime of cognitive flexibility. So I really wanted to chase that down. And it looks like they're starting to even measure at 2-3 years old. If you don't see mechanisms for cognitive flexibility, are there pieces or components that are developing? I thought that was really interesting. But what we're talking about here is they're finding a prime age about 15, 21, right in there is your prime age for cognitive flexibility. Think about this in the context of teaching reading. How old are we in the United States when we teach young people to read? And then think about the cognitive flexibility in that student too. Anyway, some thoughts. What do you think?
The 2-year-olds are just starting. And then, but it's also interesting because like in kindergarten, you're first starting. And I guess if you think about how that flexibility is still developing, when you start, you teach the alphabet and you don't necessarily teach, oh, well, this letter can also spell this sound and this sound and this sound, right? They have they're a little more rigid. And then as they go, you start introducing those other sounds and you kind of do it gradually.
Yeah. And it makes me think about just how concrete their thinking is at that age, to the point that they may not even understand idioms or figurative language. And you have to be really explicit about that. And the students who start to understand that a little bit faster than others, even inference is tricky to teach at that age too. Yeah, those are the things I'm thinking.
And I thought of it as in the structured literacy framework. So now structured literacy makes even more sense, doesn't it? Looking at it in this framework, thinking about you start with those concepts that are rule-based, really solid concepts. Lindsay, you referred to these things that are more concrete. Stacey, you said it in another way, how that would make a lot of sense when you're teaching framework to start with that before you introduce other things that don't have those sort of more concrete sort of rules to them. That will take more flexibility. So getting that base down first and being really solid with those concepts makes really good teaching practice sense, even when you're thinking of it in context of cognitive flexibility.
So when we hit it at 21, is that what it said? That's the peak?
Basically, yeah.
Do you think like the older we get, just the more rigid we are in our thinking? That's why sometimes when people are close to retirement, they're like, oh, please, I'm not changing what I'm doing in my classroom now. Like, give me a break. It's the cognitive flexibility. It's not our fault.
Yeah, which is funny about that, because I'm thinking about my students. Some of them are in that range, right? Definitely the higher end, but I guess I have a window of opportunity with them. But then I'm also thinking about my time as a literacy coach and teaching adults who demonstrated behavior that was consistent with what you just shared, Lindsay. But I think specific to the concept of morphology and their responses to that, because, with morphology, a morpheme has a general meaning and it's not always concrete. And my pre-service teachers, I actually remember noting this just a few weeks ago, seem a little more okay with that than even some in-service teachers who are like, oh, how do we even teach this if there's so much variation in what a morpheme can signify?
And I think we've joked before, Stacey. I think you've been at least at one of these with me, and Lindsay, maybe you were with me at one of these conferences where they did a presentation on morphemes and morphology. And more than a few times, some educators would get up indignant, outraged, upset, and waltz out because they were saying, well, we have to be flexible. So if we're going to pronounce we might break it this way. And if we're going to look at it for meaning, we might break it this way. And that was not okay to think about. So here's something else I want to ask you about. So as I'm reading this, I also felt a little bit schooled because, as I've mentioned, I have folks in my household. We have the ADHD profile. We got a lot of things going on. Neuroatypical, that's our way to go. We'll just label. But, and so a lot of these things made sense to me. A lot of them I was nodding my head going, oh, yes, I'm so familiar with that. At the same time, I had some moments of embarrassment where I thought to myself, why didn't I know that? Why didn't I realize that that's what that was? Because so many times, especially with my two children who have dyslexia, and particularly my one son who really struggled a lot, I've spoken about before, a lot of behaviors that had nothing to do with dyslexia, I was told, oh, that's because of the dyslexia. And it had nothing to do with dyslexia. But because I didn't know enough to tease that out, actually what my son was struggling with was ADHD. And that took us a long time to pull that out and get him the support and resources, much longer than it should have, given how much I thought I knew and how much training I'd had, that I was surprised by how still we lump things together. And really understanding and looking at these things and pulling them apart is to the benefit of our students every time. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I had a schooling moment in reading this myself. But let's move on a little bit with the cognitive flexibility. And Stacey, you talked a little bit about the profile of a student who you might already be prepared that there might be some cognitive inflexibility perhaps, and what you can do about it. So you mentioned some things about having a regular schedule. The article that we were looking at also suggested a few things, but in both of your settings and different experiences, what are some things that you've just kind of either read about and picked up and used, or you found useful over time when working with students who might have issues with cognitive flexibility?
One thing I do I have a visual timer. So, and I think I've talked about it before, but when I'm pulling small groups, my students are doing various activities, right? And so I have a PowerPoint that runs everything and shows where they're going to be. And there's a timer at the bottom, and it's like a rectangle. It's white and it slowly fills blue, like from the left. And as soon as it's all the way blue, the slides are going to switch and they're switching to the next activity. So that is really helpful for students because they can look up there and kind of gauge, how much longer they have before we need to switch.
Gosh, I really like that. I like that visual image, because it's also a good thing for time management, which can fit into this flexibility piece too, is being able to manage time within a segment. Say I need to complete a certain task. I'm not quite sure how to budget my time. That's helpful in many ways, not only to let me know when it's going to end and be prepared, but also how I might be spending my time doing that particular task. I like it for both of those reasons. Stacey, how about you?
I have been thinking a lot about behaviors that become manifest when this is something a student has a hard time with. And it depends on their age. But I did teach first grade and I could do this there. But I know that when something was disrupted in a schedule or whatever that somebody wasn't expecting and had an adverse response to, then I would let that behavior express itself in a safe way. But then later when they were calm, really try to rationalize, like give them the rationale for, can you see why acting differently would have been better? Can you see why this had to happen? And then also follow that up with, next time something like this might happen, what can you do? And just helping them be prepared for it. And some of this is just behavior 101, right? But I think being very explicit about it could be helpful depending on the student too.
So another thing, so if you think about when a young child is learning to read, and maybe they're not solid in those sound symbol correspondences, and then as they're sounding out, they're going to say one wrong, right? And then you've got to correct them. And this could be either they say it wrong or maybe there's multiple sounds for that spelling. Either one, they've got to be flexible in order to say, okay, I got it wrong. Let me try again. Or, okay, the EA wasn't E there, it was E, and they need to be flexible. So I have a student this year who really, she's a memorizer and she guesses from context, right? And we've been dealing with that all year where she's really good at it. She can memorize words really well and she wants to skip that hard part of decoding. And when she gets one wrong, then she has to go back and sound it out and she gets mad. And at the beginning of the year, she would really stomp her feet. She would have a tantrum. She'd start like whining, crying, and be really mad. She just wants to skip. She was wishing I had the books where she could just memorize the pattern, right? Which I don't. So she was really frustrated because why? She doesn't have the cognitive flexibility and also the behavior flexibility because she would start those tantrums and the stomping the foot. And sometimes she would just like put her head down and would refuse to do things. And so I'm like, oh my goodness, we need to work on that. So one thing is that in my writing instruction, I'm using an approach called SRSD, and self-regulation is a huge part. I mean, it's called self-regulated strategy development. And so we do a lot of things like self-talk. And I model this when we're writing and the students do it. And like I'll model like when I'm writing and then I'll stop and say, this is hard. My hand hurts. I don't know what to say. Oh, I can do it. Relax. Don't rush. And I start modeling, doing some positive statements and talking myself through it. And then as a class, we have come up with all these different self-statements. My class will say, persevere, you can do it, try again, don't worry, all these different things. And then every time we write, they'll choose some statements and they'll write it on their planner for writing to remember to tell themselves when things get hard. So that can apply to reading too. And that's what I told the student not long ago when she started getting frustrated. And I walked, what can you say to yourself right now? Oh, slow down. It's okay. Try again. Try my best. And walking her through that helped. Like she didn't have a tantrum. She was like, okay, she did those. We said those together and then she could keep going. So I just think, that self-talk can help in so many different scenarios.
Really like that. It makes me think of my adult students. So a lot of this is head nodding because the adult students, what do they need? Well, particularly when learning to read, they still need all those gaps filled in, right? And so we've talked a little bit about some of the recommendations that were made in the article. And what fits kind of nicely into this is you have to be able to see a clear path forward for your learning. So that was part of what the teacher needs to do, is set the clear path forward for the student to see an ability to be able to do this thing that you're asking me to do, this task. And I think that's a big part with adult students, is for so many years, they didn't get correct help. There wasn't the right support. The teaching wasn't correct for them. And so before I ever start with a student, we have a conversation about what it felt like in the past to try to learn these skills, how it will be different going forward. It's much like this self-talk, Lindsay, that you're talking about. I'm setting the groundwork for, it's okay to tell me how concerned you are about things, and let's talk about what I'm going to do to alleviate you of those concerns. And then we also talk about some of these things will be difficult. They will be challenging. So what we'll do is take breaks. We'll take breaks and we do breathing exercises. That's another form of that self-talk. It's taking a minute, filling yourself up with some good oxygen, some fresh air, taking a break for the brain for a minute and letting it back out. But these things are all, we think about them. We know that they're good practice, but oftentimes we don't put them into our practice and build it into our practice. But it definitely should be, as you're saying, it's built into writing. The other thing that you hit on there, Lindsay, when you were talking about writing is we're asking students to decode when we're teaching them to read. That's the decoding piece. The words are provided there on a page. We're working them up to being able to take the words and decode them off an entire page. We might start with words on their own, a sentence, so on as we build. But then think about writing. That is a really tough task because now we've upped it to where they're providing a lot. So cognitively, the load is a lot heavier for what we're asking them to do. So I like the fact that you've preloaded students with, let's put these practices in place for what is arguably a much harder task. Stacey, you had some thoughts.
I always have thoughts, but the most recent, when you asked that, I'll just grab it since it was the most recent. I've been dealing with this in my pre-service teacher situation, but I saw it in first grade too, is this idea of perfectionism is not unrelated to this because a perfectionist sees exactly how they think something should be. And if it is not that, then life is not okay. And I have a student who got 98.5 on a quiz, and it just drove her crazy. And it was just hard to say, hey, you've got to learn to this is okay. You still know the content. You can still, and it wasn't enough for her to correct her mistake. She had to, can I retake it? Can I, get 100%? And I honestly said, in your best interest, no. And then let's talk about how you can deal with that. And I've seen that in first graders too. And Lindsay, you kind of talked about this as well, those meltdowns when they don't get something perfect, when it's not correct, or if somebody else isn't following the rules like they think they should be, then they get verbal about that. These are all really important behaviors and mindsets to address.
It's another thing we do in our writing because we score it, and I have my students self-score first. And I tell them, why do we self-score? It's so we can get better and so we can set goals. So if you're just going to give yourself all the points, I said, score hard on yourself. If you're like, okay, I had my topic sentence, but maybe there was a little part that was unclear or not my best, don't give yourself the point for it. And then that's going to be your goal for next time is you're going to try to, so we talk about scoring hard. That scoring is not just to be like, oh, good job. Scoring is so we can learn and grow and make our writing even better.
If you're wondering where to find proven, outcome-focused ways to put the science of reading into practice, you're in the right place. Reading Horizons Discovery is the evidence-based foundational literacy program educators asked for and helped create. With integrated components that emphasize phonics, phonemic awareness, high-frequency words, and rapid assessments that make grouping and individualized instruction easy to manage and deliver, this is the program that makes literacy instruction streamlined and more successful for teachers and students alike, so all learners can achieve reading proficiency. Go to readinghorizons.com/product guide to download complete program details today.
You both, in a way, touched on these different things to be aware of as educators. You have maybe in a classroom setting, you have this student for a limited period of time, but there are things you can do to help that student prepare, because as they go along, remember, the behavior goes with them. So this is something that they will work with and try to get a handle on all through the years that they work as a student. So whatever tidbit you can offer, whatever help you can give them, they can put that in a toolkit and take it with them. And so it's thinking about teasing those behaviors out, like me thinking about my son, where I was constantly being told a lot of the things I was seeing were dyslexia, and it wasn't. It would have been a lot more helpful to know, well, that's ADHD, to be prepared to help him with that. And we've talked about maybe OCD, a perfectionism that we see maybe coming through in a student. So a lot of these things that we've hit on have definitely been mentioned within the literature about what impacts cognitive flexibility. So if you do have an interest and this has kind of piqued your interest, maybe there's some students you're thinking about, when you look it up, you'll see things like that, references to, well, perhaps a student might have a profile with, and it might be ADHD or something else, and that might provide some helpful resources and information for you. I like that we've given these practical suggestions. We've talked about what it is, what it looks like, right? And in its basic form, what we're talking about is just being able to switch between doing something else that you've been asked to do. What they've talked about with cognitive flexibility on its own without the behavior piece is being able maybe to manage a couple of tasks. So we think about that in the context of reading and how much we're asking students to do when we are teaching them to read and having them read. And this really got me thinking about that and about how many students might come prepared or not prepared. We talked about cognitive flexibility being measured even as young as 2 and 3 to see what aspects of cognitive flexibility might be present. We start really measuring about age 7 to 9. In that age group, we start really measuring. We see a really solid look at this cognitive flexibility about age 12. And then about age 12, 15, 16, even up to 21, it seems to be, it's pretty strong in there. That's our strong measure. And then we talked a little bit about how we might get rigid as we're coming on that other side. But this is something to think about in the whole range of a student's growth, right? So also it got me thinking about if we had this vision of reading where it wasn't one and done by 3rd grade, but rather we had educators prepared to intervene and continue teaching reading 4th and above, wouldn't that make a lot more sense given even what we know about cognitive flexibility? I don't know, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I just keep thinking back to when I was a child and I flipped the Monopoly board. And I'm like, where was I in that flexibility? Definitely, I was trying to think, how old was I behind the times? And that's why I flipped the board when I got mad and landed on Park Place and had to pay all my money.
Well, that's not nothing, Lindsay. I mean, nobody would.
I wouldn't do it now, but
yeah.
I don't think
I don't know. Monopoly brings out the best in all of us. But you know what? It's funny you mentioned that, because I was also thinking about myself as a child, and I'm relating some of this to those temperaments we give children. And when we were saying we can recognize some of this early on, I'm thinking about my own self. Most people who know me would not call me an introvert, but I do consider myself an introvert, but I am slow to warm up. So I'm thinking about when I was younger and I would be put in situations with a new group of people. I would take my time. I would observe. I wasn't very flexible to just jump right in and participate. It took me a minute. Even in 5th grade, I moved across town, which is a joke in where I'm from. It's like 2 miles, maybe. It took me a while to warm up.
This has just got me thinking about that one size fits all, that really when I see students that it was over by 3rd grade. I mean, my husband talks about himself who has dyslexia. He's talked about his dyslexia quite often, but he says he knew just going 1st grade. He says by 2nd grade, I knew I was well behind. There was no catching up. By 3rd grade, he said, I knew I was pretty much going to be out in the hall the rest of the way through. I mean, that's quite something to realize by 3rd grade. And here's the thing is that now, being the adult that he is, having the information that he has now, he said, even if somebody along the way had recognized some of these aspects and had helped me understand myself a little more, then that would even have helped to be able to say, hey, look, I'm seeing some of these things that might be in your profile. But he said that information for myself would have been helpful. And I think that's a lot of what we're talking about here, Lindsay, when you brought up, the self-talk, that kind of a thing, letting a student know that maybe this is harder. Maybe I'm going to struggle with this a bit. So what are some things that I can do? I think those are all very helpful. But also, this has made me question that timeline that we put our students on within the school system.
And I'm thinking too about systemically, we have really hyper focused on the product, to your point, Donnell. And if there's a way that we could shift collectively that focus on the process. I mean, when I say systemically, we're focusing on the product. By the end of first grade, you should have done this, this, and this, and this. By the end of second grade, this, and this, and this. And in some ways, depending on how you're accountable for that information, it's not okay to be on track. Even though you're not there by the end of the school year, you're heading in the right direction. Sometimes that's not recognized, right? So I think about, Lindsay, this came to my mind when you were talking about writing too. And in my writing instruction, I try so hard to focus on the process, because no matter how good of a writer anyone is, there is not a perfect writing product. It's really hard to come by. So how do we focus on the process and just keep getting better and better? And it goes along with the theme we've talked about a lot on this podcast about always being a learner, and you're not done. You're not ever done. So I think too, sorry, I'm adding a lot of thoughts onto this. Hollis Scarborough was asked if there was something she would do to improve the infographic of the reading rope. And she said, I would have put at the bottom that this process happens over time all along the rope. And I think that's significant.
So I'm just thinking a lot about how we can help a student who is like very, very rigid, very inflexible with their schedule. And I mean, we know all these things to help them, give them a timer, give them a schedule, but there's going to be like, can we protect them too much? And then a big change happens in their life or anything, and it's just complete chaos. I mean, I just wonder almost if we intentionally give little opportunities, like first maybe giving them some skills. What happens if we're going to go out to recess a little late, today or whatever? We're going to do breathing. We're going to do self-talk. We're going to do different things. And then almost, I wonder if you should intentionally do a small change to help them like work through that. But I don't know, does it get better or does it not? I just wonder, can we protect it too much? And then something major is going to happen in their life and they're not ready. I don't know.
You know what? That is a good question. As you were talking, I was thinking about the practical aspects of that. Like if something changes in their life, and the affective, how they emotionally respond to it, right? So maybe giving them those small opportunities, I feel like would be very beneficial if they're, safe and structured. But then also the attitude we have around that. And I'll give you an example. When I was reading this paper that all of you will have access to, one of the behaviors that was listed that demonstrates problems with cognitive flexibility is that they get upset when something in the environment changes. And my student who that I told you about with autism, the schedule, it was very much that. If I moved a pillow in the reading center, she noticed it, right? Everything has to be just so. So I hearkened back to something my second grade teacher did. And I think she did it for a totally different purpose, but it was the tool I had at the time. Every day in the classroom, she would change something. And sometimes it was big and sometimes it was really small. But when you found it, it was celebrated, right? And sometimes it was, I remember we had the alphabet strip on the wall, but they were separate cards. She turned one upside down. It was just something like that, right? That you notice, oh, that's different. And I think she was doing it so we were more cognitively aware of our surroundings. But so I did that. And then we just said, oh, you found it. So-and-so found the difference. And we had a big celebration with it. And that did change my students' response to when something was switched up in the environment. So I think so, Lindsay. I think that would be beneficial. It'd have to be really intentional, right?
And, I was telling you, I've read some additional research. And when I got to the end of one of the reports, is there anything that you can do to help build this in a student that maybe has a weakness? And so far, there's no real strong, they've worked on some software programs, some gaming programs, and they've seen some effect, but they're wondering if it will continue, it will generalize, that they still don't have a lot of research in that direction. So I'm hoping this continues, because that would be amazing to be able to do that. But I was also thinking about you, Stacy, and the teacher that would change something intentionally in the room. That's also a way to see the positive aspect of maybe some of these personalities, because they'll notice the change, perhaps the minute change no one else would notice. And so it can flip it to a positive and to say, oh, I'll bet who will be able to catch that and be able to see what the change is today. So that's a positive way. And then I also remember another one. There was a child psychologist that I met years ago. It was fantastic. And we had a conversation. It was along the lines of some of this. And he was talking about some of the most rigid children that come to his practice were children who had been placed in environments because the parents were concerned about how they would react to things. They were placed in further restrictive environments, so a more private setting where everything really was the same and could be controlled. And he said that was a catastrophe for a lot of these students. I thought it was interesting. So he said, as much as we can, buffer as best you can, but expose the children to settings where you can't control everything. And he said public school was one of those settings. It's one of those settings you can't control a whole lot and things will change. And he said it may be challenging. You may have to field a phone call or two from the school and go on down and help settle down a child if need be. But overall, he found that those students longitudinally through his practice, and he'd watched many of them then graduate and move on, did better, he thought, over time in just having to face those different challenges as they come. One thing he did mention that I think is a good idea is he said, have a little thing that they can have control over. If you have a student who is really challenged with this, and this is very, very hard for that student, have a small thing that they can control. So he said, whether it's a small pocket, whatever they can put in their pocket, something. And then the other things you tell the student, today, a lot of things probably won't go the way you think they will. Things will happen. You can even mention things in the past that were hard and say, some of those things could happen today, could happen tomorrow. We don't know. You might have control over this small item here, and that's okay, but it'll be okay. It'll be all right. Because remember when that happened? We're here today and it's fine. So it's just reminding them the times they were able to overcome and telling them, we're all good. We're here today. It's kind of interesting. This has been a fun topic, you guys. Fantastic. And I can't believe we've already gone 30 minutes. I should be able to know that. So we'll probably have to wrap it up, and maybe we'll do a part 2 or something else later on, or if there's more information, which I'm hoping comes, would be fun. But this has been a fun conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And the flexibility of going a little bit over 30 minutes, I think we're all doing okay with that so far. It does make me think. I'll keep thinking about this after this conversation. We all encounter situations that are unexpected, right? How do we approach those? How do we help our students focus on what they can control, what they do know, and then hopefully set them up for success, not just in reading, which is a big, important part of life, but also in life skills. So thank you for this conversation. And thank all of you who have joined us this week. Please take advantage of the article that's included in the notes and use it to improve your knowledge and practice like we did. And please feel free to join us for the next episode of Literacy Talks.
Thanks for joining us today for Literacy Talks, the podcast series for literacy leaders and champions everywhere. We invite you to join the Science of Reading Collective, our free community and resource hub, so you can stay current with new ideas, free webinars, resources, and more. And be sure to visit Literacy Talks online for resources, access to every season's episodes, and more at readinghorizons.com/literacy talks. It's an exciting time to teach reading and ensure your students reach grade level proficiency this school year. Literacy Talks comes to you from Reading Horizons, where reading momentum begins. Join us next time.